Um, First I'd like to introduce Andrew Walensky, and then Mike Blasich. Andrew, maybe I'll talk about you first, please. So one thing you probably know about Andrew is that he is on the Executive Council. He was elected in 2017, and you certainly were a very important voice during the McDonald discussions of the Supreme Court, and we really appreciated you and the other two Democrats for the vote on that. So thank you for that. We also have, and Andrew, as he said, is running for governor. In a few weeks, Dan Feltus, who also is running for governor, will be here and doing another event. Where, I'm not sure, but he'll be here to talk to us on another subject.
A few months.
Pardon me?
A few months.
Few months. Okay. It is almost November. It's hard to believe. Andrew graduated from George Washington Law School in '80, and he's been a commercial and employment litigator. In his past life, he was also a law school professor. He's defended against the death penalty in 1986. When he was 30, he argued before the Supreme Court in the Gray versus Mississippi case, and it was reversed. He currently represents another death penalty case in Georgia and was part of the New Hampshire effort to repeal the death penalty, which passed with an override of the governor's veto. We were pretty excited about that. By only a few votes. Andrew is probably best known for being lead counsel on the various cases known as the Claremont School District versus the governor of New Hampshire. Decisions were made on the constitutionality of the fundamental rights of education, but unfortunately a lot of those suggestions and decisions have not been fully implemented. I will say that the Democratic budget that we got through really did help in that instance. In fact, the city of Manchester is getting over $20 million. So despite the governor, who would have ditched all that education funding in a flash, the Democrats in the House hung firm, and we're pretty proud of that. Andrew's also been voted the Friend of Education by the NEA New Hampshire, and he's on the ACLU board. He and his wife live in East Concord and have 3 grown children. And then I'll introduce Michael, if I can turn the page. So I've known Michael a long time, and I'm proud to say Michael's lost a lot of weight. Congratulations. Got more to go. He was noticed in the Boston newspaper as a seasoned Democratic operative, which sounds pretty scary, but he is. Mike's parents were immigrants, so Mike learned early on the value of voting and being involved in the political process. He started on this path in 1992 as a Clinton volunteer, while a UNH student. He worked as a field staffer for Jean Shaheen in 1996, and she's been lucky to have him on her team for all of her elections. In 1997 to 2002, he worked on her team, and then he was the executive director of the State Democratic Party from 2003 to 4. He was John Lynch's campaign manager, deputy chief of staff, and political director, and then he was at the New Hampshire Department of Resources and Economic Development. He left that job and has since worked for Jean Shaheen 2009 to 2014, and then her re-election campaign against famous Scott Brown. The Boston newspapers called it a near-perfect campaign. In 2010, 2015, he was Hillary Clinton's state director. Steve Dupree, a consummate professional, said about Mike, and Steve Dupree is a Republican operative in the state. He called Mike a consummate professional and friend. I find him to be a very decent and honorable person in the way he conducts campaigns. Mike is now Jean Shaheen's senior advisor for her re-election campaign in 2020. He and Liz Purdy, another political operative, have 2 girls and live in Conway. Thanks. Welcome.
So I don't have my school funding stick with me. Some of you were here last year, maybe year before, where I came up to talk about school funding. I'm also not here in my capacity as a new candidate for governor. Mike and I have been invited to talk about civility in politics. Is that a fair statement? Yes. I can be more civil than you now.
If not, I'll yell. It's good.
Perfect. So in the 2016 cycle, we were in some ways counterparts. Mike was Hillary's state director, and I was Bernie's lawyer. And so we were the points of contact between the 2 campaigns, and we were invited during this primary season to come talk about those experiences.
And what's funny is What's funny is we've actually gotten to know each other very well over the last 3 or 4 years. We live probably less than a mile from each other. As the crow flies, it's probably, a 5-minute walk.
Yeah.
But it's been a real pleasure in getting to know each other. We got to know each other better, quite frankly, in the heat of a very, very difficult campaign. I'm sure that all of you were very involved with one candidate or another in 2016. In 2015, there was a lot of passion, and there was a lot of tension, to be very clear. And we always had an open line of communication with each other. We were always very frank. We were very candid. We also understood that there was a longer view that had to be had, and we were able to maintain that and think about what the road was going to look like come general election time without compromising our support for our own candidates. And so we want to talk a little bit about that experience without having to relitigate 2016, but to use it as a way to inform what was, as we were driving up, we felt like was already a much different environment with this primary than what we had several years ago. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of our background prior to 16 that helped inform what I thought was a very nice partnership between the 2 of us that set the stage for what was, in New Hampshire at least, a very good cooperative approach that ultimately, though narrowly, helped us to win two important races, and that was the U.S. Senate race, and we were able to deliver New Hampshire's 4 electoral votes. And I think a lot of it had to do with you, and quite frankly, the leadership of people like Andy Valinsky. But backing up a little bit, my worldview was informed along the way. My first start was in the primary in 1992. A little aside, the way I got to know Hillary Clinton was she visited campus at UNH, and I was quoted in the student paper saying she's the one that should be running for president, not her husband. They noticed that, but it's okay. I curried favor with the right person in that equation. It was a long view. But the reality is that going into 2003, I became executive director of the New Hampshire Democratic Party. I was in a role that I really relished there because I got to be neutral And as you recall, that was a very difficult primary. You had Howard Dean, who was amazing. You had John Kerry, again, right across the border, and then a number of other wonderful, candidates and campaigns. And so, I saw a lot of what happened. I cringed at a lot of what happened. Sometimes it was hard to watch neighbors, good friends, close friends, quite frankly, treat each other much more harshly than the candidates themselves were treating themselves. And this was all pre-Twitter, pre-social media. But we were sort of seeing a foreshadowing of what was to come, because it was the first sort of campaign with a lot more internet experience. But I remember very clearly as party executive director, that we had to really step up through the primary process, not feel like we were tipping the scales one way or another, trying to be that good umpire that nobody, quite frankly, recognizes, because that's what a good umpire is. If you don't know who they are, that's a good umpire. But that you had to create somewhat of a framework for, fairness. And I, after the primary, remember, and Karen Leo Hill's here, and I remember Peter Glenshaw, I remember as Democracy for America was starting to come to fruition, and a lot of that was happening out of Vermont and this part of the state. And that was an organization that had some healthy distrust of party establishment, et cetera. And I, rather than, and I credit party leadership as well at the time, rather than sort of resisting it or being fearful of it or nervous of it, went and said, we have a lot to learn from what you did. What you did in this past primary revolutionized a lot of politics. And again, it set the stage for, I think, a lot of the amazing stuff we saw from President Obama 4 years later. And so I just really believe, and we were talking about this on the way up, that engaging each other, thinking about each other as people, not to sound sort of a little too sappy, and sort of stepping away from those keyboards or devices and viewing each other as people carried us very nicely. And then maybe, I know there's a few things that you want to touch on, but maybe talk a little bit about, quite frankly, New Hampshire. I know Senator Sanders had a lot of engagement, involvement here in that election. And so maybe you could speak to that a little bit.